You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
The elections of 2016, 2018, and 2020 in this country came with increasing scrutiny, skepticism, and still some unanswered questions for many minds in Illinois and across the country about how elections are administered, how results are counted, and just how much can you trust that whole system from start to finish. We went to the State Board of Elections to talk with their spokesman, Matt Dietrich, to learn more months before those votes are ever cast. The campaign season officially kicked off this week on Thursday as candidates start to sprawl out across the state and circulate these petition forms asking voters to get involved in the process. A lot of voters today have concerns that when they go to process their ballot, it will be counted accurately, there will be fair access. Give us a basic synopsis of where Illinois stands in the national discussion about restricting or relaxing access to the ballot.
Well, what we saw after the 2020 election were a lot of states started enacting laws that were viewed by a lot of people as being restrictive.
19 states to be exact.
Right, and Illinois really has been the opposite. We've only made registration more accessible here. Beginning in the summer of 2018, we started our automatic voter registration program through driver's license facilities and also through the Department of Natural Resources and a few other state agencies where when you interact with those agencies, you automatically register to vote.
The idea being anytime a citizen comes in contact with state government, they're being sucked into the system to say, we want you to vote.
Correct. And I think, and obviously the driver's license system is the biggest one.
Let's focus on that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Because polling does show that anywhere from 3 and 4 to sometimes 4 and 5 Americans, depending on how the question is phrased, support the idea of walking into a ballot box or into a voting precinct, and showing your voter ID as you cast your ballot. There are other groups like the ACLU who will say, well, hang on a minute, there are minority voters oftentimes who in greater shares just don't have that ID for whatever reason. Maybe they lost it or they've gone through a transition or they don't have the money to go in and get it paid for. Is there an objection from the State Board of Elections side on just having to process that voter ID card when people are voting?
No, we don't. That's up to the General Assembly.
It is.
The rules for whether we are a voter ID state.
But would it make it harder to administer elections if that extra step of verification was done?
I'm not sure that it would be harder to administer elections. It would be one more responsibility for election judges. The issue in Illinois is that we've never had there's never been an outcry over voter fraud here related to showing ID. If there were a groundswell of support for it, that would be the job of the General Assembly to enact that, like they have in Ohio, for example.
Sure. The other part of this that maybe you can answer is some people may not be familiar with the voter registration process. So you do have to show who you are as you register.
Sure. When you register, you have to show 3 pieces of ID. You have to prove your identity and your residence. So that's in the registration process. But in the actual, when you go to vote, your signature is your ID. And a panel of election judges will compare the signature that you signed there in the polling place or on your vote-by-mail ballot, if you've sent in a vote-by-mail ballot. They'll compare that with the record that is on file at your local election authority. And if there's doubt among election judges from both parties about your signature, then you can be asked for ID. If there's an issue with your signature at the polling place and judges of each party agree that there is a potential issue with your signature not being genuine, then you will be asked to show ID.
Can you put these issues into scale for us to give us an idea just how frequent those kinds of complaints are? For example, I know you mentioned earlier that there's just not this groundswell of people demanding voter ID be showed when you're going to vote. But there is among some this open-ended concern. Maybe they don't have the evidence to say that person cheated, but they have this curiosity in the back of their mind that says, well, why not ask the voter ID? How many times in a given election would the State Board of Elections see, hey, this was an error, or this was a violation of the law, or this was a contested signature? How often does that happen?
Well, if there are violations of the law, we wouldn't see those because we don't enforce that. That comes down to the state's attorney. And we did have an incident during the 2020 election cycle where in DuPage County, I believe they prosecuted 5 cases of people attempting to get vote-by-mail ballots to vote for deceased relatives. So those cases were prosecuted. I believe
5 cases.
5.
Out of more than 1 million voters in DuPage County.
A lot of, I don't know the exact number, but quite a few. Second largest county in Illinois. You know, there are isolated incidents. There was an incident, I believe, in McHenry County where a voter lived in Wisconsin, came back and voted in Illinois, and then tweeted about having done that, and they were looking into that. But these are just anecdotal things that we hear about through the news media. We may, through our contacts with the local election authorities, hear about these things. It's not widespread enough that it becomes an all-consuming problem.
Georgia's Secretary of State, this issue of voter access, voter registration, election security is being debated in Congress right now. I'm sure you're well aware. First of all, how closely is the State Board of Elections in Illinois watching that federal debate about how closely the U.S. Attorney General might have an eye over state elections? How closely is this agency or this bureau watching that discussion?
Oh, we're aware of those discussions all the time because they potentially could affect the way Illinois administers its elections or the way any state administers its elections. And of course, you know, historically in the United States, the states have been very protective of their responsibility to run elections without overbearing federal influence. And there's a balance, as we've seen, with funding from the federal government for things like election security, which we've used here in Illinois, of course. But there's always a balance. We're always watching what's going on in Washington for how it may have an effect on us.
Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, apologies to him if I butchered his last name, he weighed in on this issue and said that automatic voter registration that Congress wants all the states to do is hard to implement. Illinois has tried to do that. Would you agree with that statement, that it's difficult to implement the automatic voter registration processes?
It certainly was here. It took a lot of effort to coordinate you have to coordinate between us, between the Secretary of State, between local election authorities. Every state has different methods that they use for registering voters. Illinois, for example, is what's considered a bottom-up state, which is where the local election authorities have most of the control. They do the registrations. They conduct the elections. We're here as kind of an administrative assistant to the local election authorities. Other states are top-down. The main control comes from, in many other states, from an elected Secretary of State. That's your top election official. And the registrations go directly through the state rather than being conducted through a county clerk's office or a local board of elections. So when you talk about having a national automatic voter registration system, that to me, having seen what it took to implement it in Illinois, sounds like an enormous undertaking because you have so many different rules about, if you're talking about driver's licenses, you know, does a state require proof of citizenship when you get your driver's license? Are there different grades of driver's licenses? How do you ensure that people who are not citizens but are here legally don't accidentally get registered to vote and get into trouble with their immigration status. It's a very complicated thing. So if there's discussion of doing that on a national basis, just based on what we've seen in Illinois, I think that would be extremely, extremely complicated.
I should preface this next question by just saying for our audience, in Illinois, the Secretary of State administers or collects or processes the automatic voter registration along with those other state agencies you mentioned, but it all kind of funnels through the Secretary of State, and the State Board of Elections, as you mentioned earlier, is basically processing. But before the pandemic hit, we were getting just headline after headline of problems with this automatic voter registration system. There was people who were not supposed to be, not legally registered to vote, who were, and then that was fixed. At this point, I know a lot of the focus has been on pandemics and changing election law, but all this time later, how confident are Illinois election officials that that issue of the wrong people being registered or the wrong people being removed from the rolls is fixed? Is that cleaned up?
That was a one-time incident. We think it may have resulted in 2 non-citizens who may have cast votes. Everyone else on that list, I believe there were 16 of them, were notified, and they were also given instructions for how to correspond with the Secretary of State in case that caused them any immigration problems. That was a one-time incident that was fixed.
I think it was described to me as a glitch in that processing hardware where you put your signature in, just like you would at a grocery store. At the DMV, you're going to fill out for your, and then somewhere in there that was routing their registration to the wrong place.
Right. If you are asked when you get your driver's license, you are asked, do you want to register to vote? Are you a U.S. citizen? You go through a series of questions. If you respond, no, I'm not a U.S. citizen, you're supposed to be kicked out of the system. That's the way it works now. It was not, there was a glitch, that's where the glitch came in when it happened with that handful of voters who should not have gone through the registration system.
If memory serves, I think there were maybe 1,000 people or so that were registered, or more than, but only a few of them actually did. So they would have gotten
Correct.
a notice from the government, from their local county clerk perhaps, that says you're registered to vote, do this.
That was the problem.
And they weren't.
And that was
or
the
they
problem.
shouldn't have been.
Which is why I believe there were 2 who voted, which is why it would be logical for them to believe, well, I received this letter, I guess I can vote. It's from my county clerk telling me I can vote.
But going into 2022, if voters were seizing on that headline from years past and looking to say, is there a flaw in the system that still exists today, you would tell them what?
No. We have not had any complaint of that nature since then. Once it was identified, it was very quickly fixed. We immediately notified all the local election authorities where these registrations had been sent to so that they could flag them. Some of them had already flagged them before we had even notified them. So that problem was fixed.
Some things are a little bit different on the calendar this year. We're used to voting on our primary candidates and those campaigns in the middle of March. This time it will be the end of June. How does that change your work here?
Changes our work here because it, for one thing, it condenses the calendar. And it actually makes the work of the candidates who have to collect their nominating petitions a little more intense. Normally, they would have 90 days to collect their signatures prior to filing them here. Because there was a delay in getting U.S. Census data to complete the remap process following the census, everything was moved back. The primary was moved from March to June 28th. Normally, candidates would start circulating their petitions right around Labor Day, and then they would file toward the end of November. Well, we moved the primary to June, therefore petition passing doesn't start until January. It starts this week it started. Candidates only have about 60 days to collect their signatures. Therefore, most offices have 1/3 fewer signatures required during this election. For us, it means a more condensed timeline because we'll be doing filing now in March, which normally we would do in November. Then there are challenges to the filings that have to happen ahead of the primary. And then, so we'll get done with the primary in June, and then immediately we'll go into filing for independent candidates and new party candidates. That's July 5th through 11th. And then you are on, from there on in, you're in it's a race to the finish into November.
All of those changes you just described were changed in the law. The House and Senate passed those ideas to the governor. He signed them. People who watched the election in 2020 and even in 2018 who were looking and saying, I should say specifically in 2020, there were some people who had questions about election security. They said, well, wait a minute, those states didn't always change their election procedures through their General Assembly, through the law. Sometimes it was the people in bureaucracy who were making changes on the fly, and they were later contested in court. In Illinois, are there any new changes or revisions to the practice or procedure of elections that was not authorized in the law?
In Illinois, there is we have no legal capacity at the State Board of Elections. No local election authority has the legal capacity to make any changes to what's in the Illinois Election Code. Everything about elections is governed in statute. That's why all these dates had to be changed by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor. We do not have the authority to change any election date. That's why, for example, in the 2020 primary, which was on March 17th, 2020, we had gone into under a stay-at-home order just a few days before that. There was a lot of discussion then. You had some other states where they were postponing their primary. Well, in Illinois, the only way that we could have moved that primary would have been if there was a court order ordering it to be changed or postponed. And we don't have the capacity here. We don't have the authority to change the election date, nor does the governor, nor does anyone else. There would have had to have been a lawsuit in court to do that. So we can't change anything on our own.
And in the aftermath of that, a lot of people who were worried about standing in big long lines or gathering in crowded gymnasiums or church buildings to cast their votes, they said, can I vote from home? And the General Assembly said, okay, if you voted in the last, I think it was 3 elections, we're going to send you a absentee ballot application or a mail-in voter application.
Right.
If you've got that in the mail and filled it out and sent it back, you'd get the mail-in ballot. Is that voter application, mail-in ballot application, still going out to?
It's not automatic this year. You won't automatically receive an application the way that.
Who will receive that automatic application then?
If you can apply for a vote-by-mail ballot.
So it's no longer just being automatic. The application is no longer being mailed out. You have to seek it out.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Are there any other changes? If I'm a voter this year in 2022, things I should look for that might be different in the process, or things that I should be aware of if I'm a voter?
From a voter's perspective, it's going to be the same. Really, the things that have changed this year are going to put more. They're going to be different for the candidates who are seeking access to the ballot. They have a shorter time to collect their signatures. They may have to collect fewer signatures. Obviously, now we're in Omicron, which is much more transmissible. There may be access issues, again, where they may have a tougher time
reaching the voter.
Correct. And normally, if you're collecting signatures in September and October, you're doing so in nice weather. You plan on going to certain public gatherings maybe and collecting batches of signatures there. Don't really have that as much, and you never know what the weather is going to be like in January and February, so the candidates will be dealing with that as well.
Matt, if I'm being transparent, first of all, I appreciate you sitting down with us on this day, but the reason we reached out to you on the first day of the campaign season I think you know for years I've often reached out at like the last day of the campaign, right before elections are happening, to scramble and say, what do we need to know about this election that's coming? I think people do have a hunger and a desire to learn more about this process. And if I can say, every time I've showed up to talk to you or a county clerk, I've walked away knowing something more about the process that I didn't know about how it worked. So with these many months between now and June and between now and November, what are the things that you would say if you were sitting down with someone in your family at a Thanksgiving dinner conversation, and they raised a question, well, I saw this on the news and it made me feel skeptical about the way elections are carried. How would you put that person at ease?
Well, first, I would explain, depending on what the nature of their doubt is. And if we go back 4 years to the 2018 election, we put a lot of effort in 2018 into reassuring voters that a data breach that had happened here at the Board of Elections to our voter registration database 2 years earlier, that had been addressed and that we had all new security here.
And no votes were changed?
No votes were changed and no voter registration was affected by that. But that really wasn't important. It's the perception that's important.
Well, sure. You don't want a foreign entity or some aligned force accessing the system.
Listen, a foreign entity can't remotely break into a tabulator and change votes.
Why not?
Because those are never connected to the internet. They're not accessible. Even the cards that are used so that those tabulators can read all the various ballot styles that are fed into them are not programmed on computers that are connected to the internet. There's complete isolation there. But that's not the important thing. The fact that a foreign remote hacker can't change votes doesn't stop anyone from claiming that they've done that.
Just the claim alone in today's world can create enough of a
That's right.
firestorm.
And that's why in 2018 we made such a strong effort to let people know we've addressed the problem that led to what happened in 2016. And we also wanted to emphasize again that what happened in 2016 had no effect on the 2016 election. It had no effect on anyone's voter registration. But it's the perception. We do not want any doubt in the public mind that our systems are secure, and our systems are secure. What I would probably tell people who are concerned about, we've heard obviously post-2020, a lot of talk about rigged elections, that sort of thing. What I would explain to someone who has any doubt about that is that we have always had a system, an extensive system of pre-testing for every piece of equipment that's used in an election. And after each election, we administer a 5% random retabulation statewide to make sure that every vote was counted exactly.
And any other political poll or scientific poll that took account of 5% of the actual ballots cast would be probably the most accurate poll we've ever done. Because that's 5% sounds small, but it's a really big share of the population.
Well, it's 5% of the 6.2 million people who cast votes in 2020.
Usually you can make a scientific poll from a much smaller segment of the population.
Correct.
And you can extrapolate that out.
Mm-hmm. And people need to understand, before every election, the testing that's done is public testing. Representatives from the parties can be there. Each candidate who's going to be on the ballot in that county can be there and witness it. So every election authority in Illinois does its best to be transparent and to show that, yes, this equipment is accurate. It is tested. Your vote will be counted exactly the way you cast it on your ballot.
Now, the Illinois State Board of Elections is full of political appointees. Governors have appointed people to sit here and administer this agency. But the state board still has a very sacred duty in this democracy, which is administering the outcome of, or administering the processes of the election. You're the spokesperson here who helps inform the public about what this place does. When you saw January 6th happen, which was people who were trying to interrupt and obstruct the certification of the outcome of those election results, did you feel at any time that just that job that you have of informing the public about elections became more dire? Do you feel more urgency about your job today?
Well, I think so. I'm not sure that January 6th, I mean, to me, that was such a once in a lifetime event. I think to me, what really brought that point home, the need to reinforce our testing and the attention that is paid to making sure that everything is completely accurate. That really came post after the election. In those maybe 6 weeks or so before January 6th, when there was a lot of talk about
Seeds of doubt, questions.
Yes, and really talk about wholesale election fraud. You know, I always equate it to a grocery store chain. Kroger, you know, some shoplifting is going to happen occasionally in any individual store. They do their best to make sure it doesn't happen.
Some spillage on the margins.
But what was happening after the 2020 election, it was as if you would have to say that truckloads of merchandise were being just taken away and disappearing from, you know, in this grocery store analogy. And it was so far-fetched, and it went so much against everything we had tried to do here in not just in 2020, but in the 2018 election, where we really struggled to make sure people felt confident in the security of in that case, it was our registration system, but also in the entire system. That is one of our top goals, is to reassure the public that you don't need to worry about the safety and accuracy of the vote that you cast.
You mentioned this big heist at a grocery store as an analogy. One of the more sinister terms that we hear around this topic of election fraud is ballot harvesting. Can you describe the chain of custody between a ballot drop box and the county clerk's office? How do we know who picked up that batch of ballots, what happened to that batch of ballots in the interim, and how do we know, is that chain of custody documented somewhere? How do we track that?
If you are dropping off a ballot for someone else, there is a section on the outer envelope where the voter has to authorize you to drop off the ballot. And
just
the
to place it in the box?
We always tell people that if you're going to do that, be sure to sign it. Generally, when people drop off multiple ballots, they'll do that at the office of the clerk.
So you're saying a representative in a community, say like a senior home, someone who works there, can collect a bunch of mail-in ballots from people who live there and go drop it off?
Now, when you talk about nursing homes, that is usually coordinated with the election authority. So they will have a system for setting up voting for the residents and delivering the ballots. In Illinois, though, the law is if you're going to personally deliver a ballot for someone else, there has to be a record. There's a section on the security envelope where the voter authorizes you to do that and where you sign that I am the authorized deliverer.
I guess if someone just drops that ballot in like one of those ballot boxes on the side of the road, the drop box, how do we know?
Well, we advise people, if you're going to have someone else drop it off, to fill out that section.
In the inner envelope, the actual ballot itself, that signature must match the registered voter who has at some time shown their ID. All of that has to be consistent. But from the point where it's in the ballot box to where it gets to the election authority, who's authorized to pick up and move those ballots to the place where they will be counted, and is that chain of custody documented?
That has to be done by an employee of the election authority, and that is in the law that when they have to empty it, there is a certain amount of time that they have to bring the ballots in from the drop box and timestamp them in and begin the processing. All of that's covered in the election
And
code.
the timestamp is key because it shows the rapid pace they were collected and put into the sorting system. It's there as a document. If anybody wants to come back and say, wait a minute, were these just sitting on a shelf somewhere, you can point to the timestamp and say these were processed in a timely fashion.
That's the intent, yes.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I appreciate this conversation, and again, I really just wanted to try and dive in and explore this with some of the questions we've received in our newsroom, and I appreciate these answers because I hope that people who have these questions will get their answers before they're flooded with doubt.
Yeah, and we've spent a lot of time here. We've gotten numerous Freedom of Information Act requests regarding our testing process. And I can tell when I receive them, because I handle FOIA requests here, that they come from people who really have doubts about, because of what they've heard. And a lot of times, it's what they've heard on social media. So I know a lot of that is out there. We're doing everything we can to let people know you don't have to worry about that. What I've said, and I said this in 2020, and I'll say it again in 2022, we don't want voters to be worried about anything to do with election security. That's our job. We have laws that tell us what we have to do regarding election security. We conduct public tests so that it's right out in the open and you can see that all of these tabulators are working accurately. After the election, we run a 5% retabulation to show, again, that it's accurate. That's what we have to deal with. Voters should not worry about that. What voters need to worry about is what they can control. And what voters can control is what they see on social media and what they choose to believe on social media.
What they choose to share.
Right. And anything that you share, when you share that, you're going to start getting more and more and more like that. That's how social media works. And I think a lot of casual users don't understand that. When you like a post,
you're inviting more of it.
You're putting yourself in the hopper to get more posts like that. So what we've tried to tell people is, if you want to be worried about something, be worried about what you can control. And that is what messages you are getting and what messages you are believing from social media. Be skeptical. If something sounds like it's not right, check our website about it. We've had, in 2016...
Some people who are skeptical would say, oh, sure, trust the state.
Right, like we're the government, so therefore we're not to be trusted. Well, there's not a lot we can do to defend against that if that's going to be your attitude. That's why the introduction of the idea of a rigged election or massive, massive voter fraud is so dangerous, because how do you defend against it? All we can do is show everyone what we do and what we've been doing every election. But like I said, we want people to be smart consumers, especially when it comes to social media, because that's where a lot of the problems came from last time. That's where a lot of the problems came from in 2016, where you had these fake posts telling people you can vote by text.
Diverting
Yeah.
Real voters from the actual process.
It's a form of voter suppression, and it can work on either side. If it's a way of getting people to think that they voted and keeping them away from actually voting, that's a form of voter suppression.
A lot of people really want to have a say over who gets to wield power in our government.
Yeah, yes, they do.
Maybe you've noticed. Well, Matt Dietrich, I thank you for, again, I'm sure this won't be our last conversation in 2022, but very insightful as always, and thanks for walking us through a little bit of this process at the outset of 2022, happy campaign season to you.
And you too, Mark. You'll probably be as busy as I am, if not much busier.
Well, we'll see about that. Thanks for having us here.
Thank you, Mark.
When we come back, a closer look at the financial backers providing financing to a controversial alternative website, spreading conspiracy theories about the election and about COVID-19 vaccines far and wide. You might be surprised by its connections to Illinois' top political mega donor. That's next.